Thank you so much, Hayden. So in my 7 minutes, I'm going to be presenting an upcoming paper that I've co-authored with a colleague at the UN, and that will be published shortly by UNDP, the United Nations Development Program. It looks at new types of risk we're facing and how they don't necessarily lend themselves to conventional methods of risk management. And so the paper argues that to deal with these new types of risks, we need more long-term thinking and more cross-disciplinary thinking. And it proposes some ways to do this. One of the new types of risks we're facing are existential risks that are caused by humans. The development of nuclear weapons in the 1950s is generally considered the first man-made existential risk. And emerging technologies, of course, bring new risks with them. The development of a super intelligent AI could wipe out humanity, or advances in bioengineering could lead to man-made pandemics. The thing about new man-made existential risks is that they are much more difficult to assess and manage. Conventional risk management methods don't necessarily work well for them. And that's because conventional methods estimate risk using historical data. For man-made existential risk, because they're new, we don't really have historical data. It's worth noting also that humanity has only survived about 80 years since nuclear weapons were developed. And so we can't necessarily put an upper boundary on man-made existential risks. Another thing is that conventional risk management is based on learning from disasters that occur. But when it comes to existential risks, they're existential. So if they do occur, we won't be around to learn from them. And another type of risk another new type of risk we're facing is interconnected risks. And I should mention that a lot of existential risks are interconnected. So there's overlap between these two categories. The level of global interconnectivity has significantly increased since the 1950s, and so has its speed. And so we're dealing with complex systems. These are systems that have many components that interact with each other. This can lead to unpredictable outcomes. They also tend to have a lot of feedback loops that can amplify effects. And they're also liable to systemic risk, which is the risk that an event in one area can cause the collapse of an entire system. To take climate change as an example, feedback loops can amplify the effects of climate change. Warmer weather causes more forest fires, which release carbon dioxide and cause more global warming. In terms of cascading effects, warmer weather contributes to the spread of disease, and that increases the risk of a pandemic. And then pandemics can cause job losses and increase poverty. And as poverty increases, so does the risk of armed conflict, just to give you an idea of some of the impacts. Our current risk management methods don't necessarily apply to interconnected risks either. Conventional risk management is based on isolating a risk and then following a step-by-step linear approach, but interconnected risks can't really be isolated. So the paper argues that effectively managing these new risks will require new ways of thinking, including the need for more long-term thinking. And this is because many of these risks will play out over the long term and they're growing. So we need to address them now, or they may grow so large that we can no longer do anything about them. Long-term thinking and planning is also really important in order to increase our preparedness and resilience. In terms of how we might implement this, at the government level, we have to overcome government's tendency to be too short-term, which is in large part due to the electoral cycle. Some countries have tried to do this by establishing a future generations commissioner to look out for the interests of future generations. Wales is a good example. The use of horizon scanning and foresight methods is also important. And here it's not just about putting out reports, but actually working to get findings implemented by policymakers. Singapore does this well. companies also have a key role to play, and we need to overcome their tendency to be overly short-term too. This is partially due to quarterly earnings reports because that increases investor focus on short-term profits. So one idea is to discourage companies from issuing short-term earnings guidance, and if they do, to put it in the context of their long-term strategy. Another is to give greater voting rights to investors that have held stock for longer periods. Now, in addition to long-term thinking, cross-disciplinary thinking is also key in order to deal with the new risks we're facing. Because we're dealing with risks that are interconnected, we need a cross-disciplinary approach to tackle them. For example, you can't address poverty without bringing in knowledge from areas like climate change, pandemics, armed conflict, and elsewhere. Cross-disciplinary thinking is also important because if you reduce risk in one area, you might increase it in others. And so you need to manage these trade-offs. So in order to implement this, we need to get government to overcome its tendency to work in silos. One approach that some countries have used is called a whole of government approach, and that brings different government departments together to jointly find solutions to challenges. The UK has done a lot of work in this area. Another method is to encourage.
If I'm going to just ask you to wrap up. Sorry to interrupt. It's really interesting.
Sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
Oh, could I ask you to just move towards wrapping up? That'd be great.
Yeah, I'm almost there.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, sorry. So it's 7 minutes exactly. Another method is to encourage the update of systems thinking. So this involves examining how the components of a system interact with each other rather than just looking at an individual component. And there's also emerging work on new risk management approaches to take interconnected risks into account. So conventional risk management uses risk assessments that only take 2 dimensions of risk into consideration, impact and likelihood. And one new approach extends this to include 2 additional elements, interconnectivity and velocity. So it's important to foster this kind of work. So I like to conclude on a positive note. So of course, feedback loops can amplify risks, but the flip side of that is that feedback loops can also amplify the positive impacts of policy interventions. If you target a policy intervention to address a risk that's a root cause of a number of other risks, you could reduce risks across all those other areas as well. And so of course, that means we can also spend more effectively. So leveraging long-term and cross-disciplinary thinking will be key in order to do this. Thank you.
Wonderful, thanks so much. So if I can, yeah, I think that was really interesting, especially all the different case studies from around the world of successful work on this. Does anybody have a question that they'd like to ask Caroline in the room? Looking around, yes, please.
Hi, Rick Davies. Has there been any feedback from any parties in the financial sector about the appropriateness and workability of giving some shareholders who are long-term shareholders additional voting rights?
So this is actually something that we may start working on. So I think I heard Hayden at the very start talking about some work that we're doing in Parliament, running an inquiry on long-term thinking in policymaking. And so that's really focused on what we can do to get governments thinking more long-term. And so I think it's very likely that we may do a follow-up event, basically a follow-up project that'll look specifically at companies. We had, do you know Professor Oliver Hart, Nobel Prize winner in economics? So he actually came to talk to us in Parliament to basically share his views on how we could be getting shareholders to be more responsible, like to basically be thinking more long-term and be more responsible and thinking about things like sustainability, or get companies to be thinking about this. So I think that's, for me, this is such an important area to be looking at. So it's kind of earmarked as like probably our next big thing after looking at government.